30 years plus in psychiatry and mental health. That's why he's the expert, and we chat with him about all different things. How are you doing today, Dr. Patino?
Well, I'm doing very well. It's been a busy day. We did a webinar earlier today, and that was successful, but it was tiring. It was intense, I think.
I listened in and it was quite good. Folks, by the way, he does give information to professionals as well. And as you know, this is a live show. So please go ahead and type in the comments. We'd love to answer some of your questions on air live. And if you were listening later on YouTube, please also leave some comments. We can get to it, those questions maybe in the next show coming up. Again, the only you is about you. And Dr. Pino is sharing his wisdom, both to practitioners today and, of course, to you. And I wanted to ask about some items that have happened in the news recently that I think you could have some insight into. And that's mainly some of the violence, in particular the shootings that have gone on recently here in the United States. Trying not to be overly political, but I work in a field, as we've alluded to before. I've done many things, and one of the things I do is actually teach violence, self-defense, but violence in the actual application, whether it's firearms, edge weapons, impact weapons, and there's a mental side of it, an intellectual side of it, and also spiritual and ethical that I find to be interesting because from on my side it's about protection, it's about empowering people, not about destroying others' lives. But these people who are out there um, snapping, having quote unquote bad days, as we've heard on the news, and then applying violence to complete and utter strangers. What's the psychology behind that, or is it truly a psychiatric issue?
Wow. God, I don't even know where to start with that. There are a lot of things that are behind the psychology of violence, right? The psychiatry of violence. But I think that is before we get into the intricacies of people reacting in violent ways, it is important to understand one concept, and this is something that you hear a lot from us psychiatrists, and is that patients with psychiatric disorders as a group are not more violent than the general population. This is important to understand because we tend to stigmatize people and to label them, right? So we because we don't understand mental illness in general as a society, we tend to be afraid of what we don't understand, right? So it's very easy to scapegoat people with mental disorders. Let me give you an example. I mean, I've been following the news on the Boulder, Colorado shooting that happened yesterday, and I was listening to the news, and in some outlets, you're hearing the patient had a history of mental illness, right? And when you start making statements like that without knowing the facts, you start labeling, you start stigmatizing, you start inciting fear in some people that if somebody has mental illness, they may kill you. I mean that comes down to the translation, right? In a lot of people's minds. So it's important to understand, and I'm telling you this as somebody who's been seeing psychiatric patients for 33 years, and I've seen violence, okay? But I've seen more violence outside of psychiatric hospitals and inside of psychiatric hospitals,
Mm.
right? So now, what happens with psychiatric violence is that sometimes when you have a rare case of psychiatric violent episodes, they tend to be pretty intense, right? And they tend to be um, involving sometimes not only other people, but the individual themselves. So it's important to put that in context, right? Then you get into the sociological and psychological issues of what leads people to violence, right? The purpose. What is the purpose of the violence? And violence may have a multitude of purposes, anywhere from delivering a message to retaliation to soothing of a narcissistic injury. There are all kinds of different possibilities. Racism can be a reason for violence, you know, the fear of those who are different, you know, uh, the lack of acceptance, okay, can be a source of violence. But violence in general, okay, and you probably know this because you work with this, it has to do with power, okay? the feeling that I have control over somebody else. And that can be in response to an injury, or can be in response to hate, or can be in response to delusions, right? There are a lot of potential reasons why you want to feel that you have power and control, which is kind of like the basis for, like, say, domestic violence, which is another type of violence, right? It really has very little to do with with sex, or it has a very little to do with um, wanting to impose yourself. It used to demonstrate that you have the power and control, and that it should not be challenged, right? So we keep going back to the issue of power. Now, from the psychiatric point of view, when you're dealing with people who are imbalanced, whether it's in their personality, or whether it's uh, because they have a serious mental disorder, not unusually can be one of two reasons. One is that you're delusionally responding to an external stimuli that is not real. That's delusional, right? That you have to attack somebody who's attacking you. And we see that often in patients who are severely psychotic and paranoid. And it's not necessarily that they're trying to impose power and control. They're trying to defend themselves by being aggressive.
Mm.
And that is the type of violence that we see with kids a lot, right? In terms of, I don't want you to invade my space. So there's some sort of a protective violence, if you may, right? To keep people away from you. We see that a lot in autism, for example. That's where we see some violence, and some other people with cognitive deficits. But the most dangerous type of violence from the psychiatric perspective is what we call a narcissistic injury. Is when your value as a human being is being questioned and you're being shamed. That combination is terribly, terribly impactful to the individual who's narcissistically imbalanced, right? Because it's not that you want to hurt somebody else because you want them to feel pain. It's because you want to hurt somebody else because of what they're doing to you,
Mm.
right? And to be narcissistically disordered and violent in a narcissistic sense can be very destructive, because what you're trying to reflect is the lack of sense of inner value, right? And that's very destructive. I mean, let me give you an example, and I've seen this happening before. Uh, an individual walks into his house and he finds that their spouse is in bed with somebody else, right? He pulls the gun and shoots them both, right? And then you say, well, afterwards, you ask him, why did you kill them? And most people would say, well, because of what they were doing, right? No, he killed them because of what they were doing to him.
Mm.
So shame, in a roundabout way, can be a tremendous force toward violence. And we have to be very careful with that.
And do you think this is why so many of these people, again, lately we've had, Asian people of Asian descent being attacked, or certain ethnic groups, because that the person, the individual, is feeling, I guess, aggressed by those people, and it's the pain they're feeling is because of these people, and then trying to rectify that through an assault of their own. Is that kind of how it works?
Well, I mean, rectifying will be a high level of purpose, right?
Mm.
I do think that some people will react violently toward those who are different because of your own insecurities, right? I mean, attacking an 85-year-old Asian elderly person, I mean, it requires that you feel so insecure that you believe that that individual is responsible for your misery, right? Um, Sometimes it's just to impose your hate, right, into people, and to some degree to show that they're not as powerful as you are, right? Which is really sad, because it just reflects a lot of emptiness, and it reflects a lot of misery on these people. So think about living in a bubble of misery all the time, and all the time being angry, and you feel that everybody in the world is trying to take what you have but you really don't own. right? I mean, when you get into political issues where people believe that they have ownership of a country, right? I own this. And when you fall into the delusion of ownership of something so subjective as a country, that makes you terribly vulnerable, right? Because then everybody wants to take what you think you own, right? And I don't think that countries or territories are owned. I mean, we may belong to them, we may be part of, right? But the whole concept of country is an agreement. It's not a thing, right? I mean, it's not like I own this thing, right? We have agreed as citizens of this country to live together under certain rules, right? If somebody says, no, I don't want to have the rules because this thing belongs to me. So you're going to have to live by my rules, right?
So it's really breaking of a large social contract.
Yeah. I mean, it's more than the social contract, is your inability to understand that you belong, right? So when you get into that limit bubble of misery of you own this, right? And you're always going to have to defend what you own, right? And instead of being part of, right? And being willing to be part of a social contract. And I think that in reality, most people are agreeable to a social contract. We live it every day. But there's some extremes of society that tend to believe that they're not to be part of that social contract. And the only option they have is to create their own rules, right? Outside of the norm. And you see, I'm using terms like norms, values, balance, because that's where life happens most of the time, right? We have this utopia idea of life being, I don't know, like a big party. No, life, probably half of life is pretty miserable to most people, right? Most people are not really enjoying getting out of in the morning and they're gun ho, I'm going to be conquering my job today. No, I mean, people struggle and they do it because it's part of the the individual and social contract. I'm going to support my family, I'm going to feed, I'm going to make sure that they have an education, the things that are basic for any society, right? Most people would participate in that. But when you get into the extremes, you get into they are taking my country.
Mm.
I mean, I was listening to the news today, and they were talking about, and the first thing that came to my mind was people are gonna start thinking they're coming for my guns. I
Oh
always found
yes.
I've always found that phrase terribly interesting, um, and I mean I've been hearing. I mean, I'm 60 years old, so I've been hearing this for a very long time, right?
And it still hasn't
And
happened.
well, I don't think that it's possible that they will come for your guns, right?
It's logistically impossible to do. Yes.
Correct. So outside of the logistics, and I think that during the COVID pandemic, and we're still in it, but we're in the last stages, I hope. And during the inauguration of Biden, I mean, the sales of guns went off the roofs, right? It's
Well,
like,
as you know, I work in that industry, and yes,
yeah,
it's almost impossible to find items. Ammunition is at an all-time high. Back in the day, a box of 9 millimeter ammunition simply to do range work, to put little holes in paper, used to be 10 bucks a box, is now almost $40 to $45 a box.
yeah.
It's insane. And people, yeah, responded because they think they had to have the gun.
Yeah, but you see, what I find is that, and I don't think that one of the problems in the United States is that we have made is studying the issue of guns not legal, right? You can go in and study anything that has to do with guns, and I always find that fascinating. You can do research on this stuff, so we don't know who's buying the guns, right? So, but I have a feeling, and this is just a feeling, and I don't usually go by feelings all the time. that the same people that have a lot of guns keep buying more guns,
They do.
right?
I'm
So
I'm probably the only gun guy who only owns one or two just for my work. Others
yeah,
own safes full of them. They collect them. It's like Care Bears and teddy bears. It's another thing to make them feel a little bit better. Now there's true enthusiasts who just like to enjoy shooting different firearms, like people who collect cars. But a good chunk of them, it's interesting because it's like, oh, for my self defense, I'm like, okay, well, how many of these things are you going to be able to carry?
and not only
Or use
that,
it any one time. Well,
exactly.
but it's an interesting mindset of hoarding or bringing things in to be ultra prepared or to have options for something that statistically is so improbable that it's really not even worth considering at times.
Yeah, but you see, and you can probably have more insight on this than I do, and it has to do with purpose, right? We don't explore purpose anymore. Uh, yeah, I don't have any problem with most people owning guns and keeping them for their own safety, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think that that's totally acceptable. I mean, I grew up in a family that had guns, and I grew up in a semi-military family, so I'm not alien to that. But there's got to be a point of um, why people need automatic weapons, right? I mean, you may want to collect one, right? But what do you need five? And why do you need to show up your gun when you go and protest at a capital, like Arizona Capitol, for example, right? And then you're knocking at the door with your guns. Purpose. What is the purpose? I mean, I can only think that, I mean, that's intimidating to me, right? Um, and I have to tell you, I mean, and we see this with, and I discuss this with my students all the time because we have to be prepared for potential violence, right? We have
Absolutely.
to deal with violence, uh, not only directed toward other people, but directed to us. You know, people very often are delusional, that they don't recognize what we're doing. We get threats all the time. And I always ask, what's the purpose of threats, right? Why do you want to show up your gun? I mean, most of the people that are going to cause the most damage will not threaten you.
They'll just do it.
Yes. And in my business, we're not in the business of predicting violence. We're not in the business of predicting suicidal behavior. I'm in the business of defining risk. Who is at risk of it, right? So if you own guns and you have anger problems, you're at risk of acting violently with a gun. And that is not the responsibility of the government or the psychiatric system or the police to stop that. It's the responsibility of the individual. We get into the issue of honest, good ownership of guns, right? That you recognize your risk. And this happens all the time. People always come and tell me, is my child going to commit suicide? And I have to say, I don't know. But I can tell you that there's a risk for suicide based on these parameters, right? And now that we have recognized the risk, we have to do something to reduce the risk. So if we recognize that there's a risk of violence in the community because of political situations, because of anger discontrol, because of what just happened January 6th, right? Because there's a lot of angry people out there with guns, right? What are we doing to reduce the risk, right? What are we doing and what can we do from the legal perspective, or what can we do from the societal perspective? Because I think it's important to understand that it's not the guns that we need to be afraid of. We need to be afraid of the people who are so angry that they're willing to use it as a way of demonstrating that they have control over something, right? And I may be somewhat naive, but I've seen this happening. You cannot fight violence with violence, right? We cannot say, well, let's shoot them all. Can't do that. You have to extend your hand and say, well, I understand your anger. I hear you. I may not agree with it, and I may not agree with the premise of it, but what can I do to help? Here's my hand. Okay. Because a lot of these people who react in angry ways are really scared.
Mm.
right? I mean, I honestly believe that some of the people who react in angry ways and that they don't let you talk and they're always arguing their point and they have their own set of facts that nobody else agrees with, right? They're trying to tell you something. And very often, what they're trying to tell you is that they're afraid, but they will not recognize that feeling. It's a lot easier to be angry than to be afraid.
Oh yeah, and again, I encounter this quite a bit often in my other work. People coming for concealed weapons permits and firearms training, and I always push it. I ask them. I said, I really want you to look at your life, look at the reality of your life, and tell me why you're here. And oftentimes, yeah, I can get them to admit a certain amount of fear and anxiety, and then we discussed that as you've said many times before, fear and anxiety are natural things. They're just what keep us safe, so we don't run off a cliff or walk face first into a lion. But irrational fears, and I try to talk to them about that. Let's bring it back. I always use the analogy of going to the beach. I say,
Mhm.
what are most people afraid of when they go to the beach? And everyone says, well, sharks. It's okay. Well, what are the statistics on shark attacks? Virtually nil if we just went down to San Diego. I mean, yeah, if you're in the Bahamas and it's white tip reef shark breeding season, it's at night and there's a feeding frenzy, you have a cut on your leg, well, it's going to increase the possibilities. But in general, we should worry less about the shark and worry more about swimming and riptides and things like that. And instead, they put a lot of their energy into the most devastating fear versus the most common probabilities. And we talk about that possibilities, probabilities, and plausibilities. And it's just interesting to watch people. You have to slowly allow them to discover that. You can't tell them, or they otherwise that anger pops in and they will argue with you to the end.
And I think that you do have a point, but again, back to the only you, there's got to be a sense of personal responsibility, right? But the personal responsibility comes with consequences, right? You have to accept that you may need some help to be responsible, right? I mean, I remember this friend of mine who he was a very angry, lonely, aggressive person, right? But he never bought a gun. And I asked him, how come you don't have a gun, right? Talking about guns. And he said, because if I have a gun, I'm going to use it. And I don't want to use it. So you have to know you, right? You have to understand what you're capable of. And it's not that he was ill intentioned, but he would tell me, I can get angry enough that I will use it.
Mm.
I would shoot someone just because they make me angry. And of course, he never bought a gun. He never had to use it, right? And he went into some counseling and got some help to the issues that were leading to him being so angry. But I don't. It's like you should never have an argument with anybody if you're angry, right? Well, you should never buy a gun if you're an angry person because
And,
you're increasing your risk.
and that's often used as the argument for this immediate, we have to ban guns and this is that someone gets angry, they can so easily obtain a firearm, then of course, and apply that firearm. But I mean, really, I guess it's about personal responsibility because I've had the opposite happen. I've had friends who are very well trained, some military friends of mine who are going through some very difficult times in their life, who have come to me and said, "Here, take my guns for a while."
Mhm.
Not because they were worried about hurting others, but they were worried about hurting themselves actually at certain points.
Yes.
And that's that really true, and these are again some commando guys, so they were not just normal people, very tough individuals who are very self-aware and realize, look, I need to just be away from these things for a while. How do we though inculcate that personal responsibility um, for the average person so that instead of grabbing a gun and going off and shooting up a school or a church or whatever, they can get a handle on these things before they start physically pulling a trigger.
You see, responsible gun ownership is not going to happen in this country until it's a good business, right? I mean, it really comes down to that. I mean, there are organizations out there that are very responsible. I have to think that back in the day when the NRA was formed, maybe that was the mission and the vision, right? Responsible ownership. I think that at some point it got diverted somewhere. And I don't know much about the NRA, but I do think that organizations usually get started with a more altruistic middle road, trying to help people that owns guns, not just to keep them, but to own them responsibly. And I think that there's some chapters of the organizations that manage guns that continue to do that, right? I mean, if you're going to buy a gun, you trained, know how to use it, know what the purpose of the gun is. I'm not opposed to that, right? What I'm opposed is to indiscriminate release of guns that are not intended for protection, that
Mhm.
are intended for killing, right? And I remember, I mean, back I think it was up until 2001, 2002. Before that, there was a ban on automatic weapons. Remember,
Yes,
that was lifted in the early 2000s for political reasons, right? But that was generated from the Brady Bill back when Reagan got shot, right?
correct.
So there was I mean, it took a president getting shot to do something about it, and nothing has happened since, right? I mean,
Yeah, but that bill also essentially really didn't change much. I was in the industry back then. Yes, you couldn't have telescoping stocks and certain little things, but essentially, certain weapons were all completely available until individual states like California started doing some additional things, and it was a political minefield for the people who actually voted for it. They got in trouble, so everyone backed off significantly. Um, but your views of gun control or gun ownership, I think, are valid. I think most people would agree. But again, what about that psychology or again the psychiatry of a person? What makes them take that next step, and how could maybe possibly some of us um, recognize that and others around us?
I think that you mentioned a minute ago your friends, special forces that bring the gun to you because they're concerned they may use it on themselves, right? And you started by saying they were going through a difficult time, right? I think that very often going to difficult times and finding yourself alone and not being comfortable with who you're left with, meaning yourself, right, may precipitate your mind to start going into a lot of places, right? One of those places that commonly happens is my life is not worth anything. I might as well be dead, right? And some people do pull the gun and kill themselves or hang themselves or take an overdose. Uh, Interestingly enough, I don't get to see a lot of those people because they die,
Hmm.
right? I get to see the ones who did not succeed or they asked for help before they got to that point. But interestingly enough, the statistics on suicide over the last 50 years have not changed very much as a percentage of the population.
Hmm.
Yeah. So the whole concept of suicide prevention should be changed to suicide risk assessment and identification, right? Because the completed suicides continue to happen and actually has gone higher in terms of violence towards self among adolescents, which is the population that I treat the most, and the elderly. Okay. An interesting in statistics is that for some reason, when men lose their wives late in life, they tend to resort to suicide much more often than when women lose their husbands. And I don't know what the message is on that, but something is kind of twisted there, right? So the reality is that violence toward oneself is a problem, and then violence toward oneself can easily be turned into violence toward others, meaning my misery is your fault,
Hmm.
right? And if I kill you, I'm less miserable. The problem is that that's never the case, right? So that it gets into a semi-delusional way of thinking that everybody's against me because I'm not worth anything, and very often in this type of situations, the individual who's performing these acts is really ready to die, right? I mean, and it happens often that the mass shooters get killed in the process. Because to be able to do something like that, you have to be willing to take a bullet yourself, right? I mean, it would be kind of insane to think that these people are planning it in a way, right? That they are having an escape route or something like that. Use
But
use
but they
doesn't
also
happen.
but they also haven't gone all the way to the other side of being a suicide bomber,
Yes.
which would be significantly more effective, and take care of their problems. They don't have the ramifications afterwards.
Well, you're getting into a very delicate issue because it's very you're getting into cult, right? And how a cult can convince you that your life after death is more valuable than your life here. And I think, I mean, from the psychiatric point of view, I think that's the ultimate manipulation, right?
Mm.
Uh, because usually the one who sends you with the suicide vest never decided to put the best on themselves, right? You go, not me. How did that happen? You know, the indoctrination that is required, right, to believe that you're doing good by negating your basic instincts of survival, right? And then take away a bunch of other people with you because of whatever promise of future something. As far as I'm concerned, from the psychiatric point of view, it's delusional, right? But I think that is somewhat cowardly from the ones who are directing, right? Because if they really believe that, they should put the
They do
best
it
on
themselves.
themselves,
Yeah.
right? Because basically what they're saying is me being here is more important than you being here. So I'm more important than you, which in a roundabout way reflects the fact that there is an inner sense of no value to your life, right? And that idea that every life has value is terribly important, right? Nobody deserves to die. There's no such a thing as deserving to die. Now, and don't take me wrong. I've seen a lot of bad people. I've interviewed serial killers, right? I've been in rooms with them for hours, right? I can see either their delusionals or their sociopathy and their psychopathy and their badness, right? But nobody deserves to die. I think that everybody deserves to have consequences, legal consequences from their behavior, right? So that I think that that's important. Um, but this idea that we gain something from killing people is a pretty twisted idea, right? And I understand retaliation, I understand revenge, I understand all those things, but that shouldn't be acceptable as part of humanity, right? Because really, you are betraying your values and what's valuable. And if we cannot agree on what's valuable, and we cannot agree that life is valuable, then we are prone to repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again, right? Now, is this going to stop for political reasons? No, right? Uh, I think the first mass shooting that I heard of, I must have been like 8 to 8 years old. You know, the shooter in the university in Texas. You
Yep. On
know,
the tower. Yep.
the tower.
Hmm.
And I was little when that was going on. It's been going on for a long time.
And before that, it was axe murderers, and people laugh about that. They say, "Why did they say that?" Well, because it was the most accessible weapon. People had wood burning fireplaces and stoves, so when the angry person showed up, there's an axe right there. It was an easy weapon to grab. It's morphed into the firearm now, but it's
Yeah,
still this.
and
But it's still the psychology that drives it, not the actual weapon that's
exactly,
being used.
exactly. And you know, we saw a lot of anger on January 6th, right? And there's a lot of political implications of that. But what I find fascinating is the blindness of the anger, right? It's like I have to let you know that I feel so powerless that I have to do this to wake you up, The problem is that the people need to be awakened are not waking up,
Mm.
right? Because the reality is that political expediency has become more important than human life. I mean, we don't need to go too far to understand that, right? And that is dishonest, right? Which takes me back to values. I mean, we don't have to agree politically. We don't have to like one person or dislike the other. We don't have to be fighting politically. Or we could. Hey, let's say that we can agree to disagree, but we cannot disagree on what is the value of humanity.
Mm.
What is the value of being caring and loving and kind and compassionate and industrious and understanding and responsible? Those are basic concepts, right? So if you tell me you have no value because you disagree with me, then we lost the communication, right? And it used to be that we will respect each other's values and disagree on the concepts, right? Now you're automatically a bad person, okay? Whether you're on the left or on the right, okay? If you don't agree with each other. And I mean, this is for another program, but the whole concept of cancel culture drives me crazy
You and me both.
because I mean, there's nothing, I mean, the concept of perfectionism being the rule, right? And not ever having made mistakes negates the idea that it's not about what you've done, it's about your history and what your history has taught you, what you've learned from your history, right? And what they're basically saying now is ignore your history and negate it. If you were homophobic one day, you're a bad person. How did that happen? I mean, that's the most ridiculous argument I've ever heard. I mean, it's totally devoid of intellectual uh, curiosity and understanding of humanity, right? I am the product of my life and I've done bad things in my life, right? So you're telling me today that I need to be punished for the mistakes I've made and that I learned from? How did we get there?
Yeah, it seems everything's been reduced to just simple binary choices, and that's it. It's just been overly simplified without any intellectual interchange or discourse or understanding. It's on or off. Everything's on or off. Just a bunch of switches instead of the reality that it's a gradation. And you're right. It's the experience that has changed people, morphs people. Again, I have friends, as when you know, in the military. Okay, they've killed people in defense of this country, maybe even in saving their own friends. Does that make them horrible people, murderers? Maybe for some. Some of them regret it, some of them don't. But they've all learned from those experiences.
But you see, we get back to the issue you mentioned before, which is the social contract, right? And for as long as we have decided as a society worldwide that we have borders and we have differences with other countries and political differences, and that somebody wants to upend the other one, we need to have defenses, right? That's part of the social contract. And part of the social contract is that the people who defend us, right, sometimes have to kill other people. Now, we can disagree for how long, right? Like the Afghanistan 15-year thing, or no, it's 20 years now. You know, what did we accomplish from doing that? Well, we accomplished some things, right? Uh, we have been in Germany since, I don't know,
Long time.
1940s, yeah,
Long
since the
time.
19, before I was born, right? And we're still spending a lot of money. So the question we need to be asking is, we have had a social contract, okay? And we can change the contract if we agree democratically to change it, right? But so far, those are the rules of the game. Now, there's some people at the fringes that don't like the rules, but they don't like any rules
Hmm.
except their own, right? So social contract is important as long as we have values that have written the contract, right? And we're not there. I mean, we've seen it, and we started with a conversation on violence against Asian people, mass shootings. We still have a lot to learn, and we still have a lot to hurt. But I think that if we go at it with the proper values, right? we can get closer to where we need to be, which is respecting each other's differences instead of saying your differences are my enemy.
Mm.
So that really needs to start changing somewhere. But it needs a lot of will, right? And there's got to be some common purpose that we can find. And I don't think that we can do it without empathy. I'm a big empathy hawk, if you may, right? In that it's not my job to necessarily tell people what to do, but to listen and listen empathically and offer them my listening. Maybe offer them a hug. I don't know. Use something, right? So it's important to stay focused on where do we want to get to, and we need to stop thinking of we just want to get to the next election. We're going from election to election to election. There's got to be like a 50-year plan, right?
Mm.
The US 50-year, where do we want to be? I don't know, 2075. And instead of, um,
2024.
well, 2022, I mean,
We're in
everybody's arguing,
2022.
right?
Yeah,
The
already.
next election. And that is sad. I mean, it's really sad that we can only see that far.
Well, you know what? It's checkers playing versus chess. And
Hmm.
chess is about strategy. It's about the long game. Checkers is just how many little pieces of the board I can grab. And it always ends the same way, right? Win, lose, or draw, with no real direction. Um, you're right. I think we have to look at that. And of course, yeah, the base is values first, planning second, direction third.
Yeah, I mean, we when we start, and we talked about this earlier, when you start a business, you start with a mission and a vision, right? And then you start developing your strategy. I don't see any mission or vision in this country right now.
Mm.
And I don't see any strategy besides the next election. And that's sad. I think that people needs to go back and do an internal analysis and said, okay, where do I belong? What do I want for me? How can I how can I make some changes? How can I tolerate, those who are different than me? And that goes in all directions, you know. I grew up in Mexico, which was a more of a homogeneous mixed population of Hispanic and Indian people, right? And you go to Japan, and most of the people are pretty homogeneous. They have concerns about people who are different than them, right? This is not just the United States. It's that we have taken it to an extreme. We always been guarded toward anybody who's different than us. We're very tribal that way. It's just that we have intellectualized tribalism in a way that is very destructive.
Mm.
And none of the tribes are going to make it if we
Yeah,
continue doing it this way.
and the sad part is that there are tribe out there now, probably, quite frankly, cheering on the acts of these people, because it fits their paradigm versus the larger whole of humanity and our nation.
Yeah. And I'm not talking about globalization or anything like that. I'm just talking about us.
Yep.
And we only control what we do individually, right? It's nice to be part of a mass group, right? And feel that you have power because you belong, but you only have the power that comes from you, not from the group, right? And sometimes people are afraid of leaving that sense of protection, that you have in large groups.
So what do you tell the people who are concerned of future acts? I know myself, my 2 cents is really simply still look at the statistics. It's still incredibly rare that you would ever be directly associated with this, but still, again, it's the shark, right? It's that greatest fear. How should people look at themselves and look at their friends, their family, their community, and manage the anxiety that's going to maybe push them to do some things or say some things or act out? What's the next step for somebody that's actually truly afraid that this is going to happen to them next?
Well, first they need to find support, right? They need to let somebody know they have fears, right? Because just letting somebody know that you're afraid is a risk, right? Because we very seldom, especially men in particular, don't like to be telling somebody else, I'm afraid. right? But you have to be able to say it in some way that is adaptive, that is acceptable. You know, you can do it to your friends, you can do it to your church. Don't let alcohol and guns control your life, right? So you have to open up, you have to take that risk. And sometimes that requires professional help. The second step that you have to take is start taking more extended risks, right? Like, I don't like black people, but maybe if I talk to one, I can find out what happens, right? But listen empathically what the other person has to do. And it's an awkward situation, but you have to start somewhere, right? Because a lot of the people who have hate toward people who are different never had communication with the different people, right? You have to take that risk. And you need to understand that we don't have control over mass shootings, right? You don't have control over the person that wakes up one morning, grabs a rifle, and goes to a supermarket and shoots 10 people. We don't control that, but we control what we do. And what we do needs to be balanced, right? So it shouldn't be extreme. I mean, we have some people that after a Boeing 727 crashes, right? And 300 people die or 200, whatever the number is, they don't want to get into a plane. It's the same situation, right? I mean, what is the likelihood of you dying in an airplane? We take that risk all the time. We don't even think about it. What is the risk of getting into your car and getting into an accident? It's actually greater of dying in a car accident than dying for an airplane crash, right? But we take the risk. So why not take the risk of meeting people, right? Why not take the risk of going to a different church when not everybody's of the same race and the same group, right? So learning to be uncomfortable may teach you something,
Mm.
right? Uh, don't negate and avoid the people just because of what they look, right? But you will never learn, if you don't go and volunteer in a, I don't know, St. Vincent's de Paul kitchen, right? To feed the homeless. You're always afraid of the homeless. Maybe you'll learn something. So that's when I get back to the issue of you only control what you control, the choices you make. And if your choice is isolation, it's not going to lead to something healthy, right? We're not made biologically to be isolated, right? And we can spend hours talking about the biology of isolation, but we're not made for that, right? So I think that people have it in themselves to start taking risks and take a long-term approach and say, I'm gonna quest that in the next 5 years, right? I'm not gonna be afraid of black people or Mexican people or Asian people. It's a lot easier to get into your bubble of misery and hide with a small group of people that you feel comfortable with, but you're not growing.
It
It doesn't.
wouldn't have been amazing if that gentleman in San Francisco, instead of throwing a punch at that woman, would have just reached his hand out and said, "Hello, I'd like to have a chat with you."
Yeah, I don't understand your culture. Maybe you can learn something from them. You know, uh, and just because they're Asian, I mean that is insane. I mean, I mean, I don't use these words very often, but I would call that individual a coward, right?
Hmm.
In the whole extent of the word, because it's just not recognizing the value of the other person's humanity.
But see, you use the word coward, and it's again based on values and humanity, and other people want to label it as insane or mental health or mental illness issues, so that they don't have to look at the greater issue of values and communication and the like. It's easier to put it in a little box and label it, and then to actually accept that, okay, this person had some issues, and not necessarily mental health issues or mental illness issues. They had other issues of their values, of communication, of bigotry. Those aren't they're not illnesses, they're just states of being.
Yeah, but you see, until we recognize that when we are being violent with other people, we're actually being violent to ourselves, right? That you're hurting you. I mean, there are very few people in this world who are truly sociopaths, right? And they would probably won't do something like that. They would ignore it because they're more calculating, you know. Those are the people everybody needs to be afraid of
Oh yeah.
because they plan things, they don't act impulsively, right? But I mean, if you said this guy that pushed the elderly person in San Francisco, maybe he had attention deficit disorder, right? And it's impulsive. Maybe it was angry and he just the person became available. But they're doing it to themselves, right? Because you have to live with you. Nobody has to live with you but you. People have the choice of not being with you, right? But you don't have the choice of not being with you. Hence the only you, right?
And there we are, right back to it. It's still all about you out there. And again, we hope that you will join us for future programs. We are reaching out to some guests that we think you might find very interesting. My friend spent 11 years in the NFL, is now a therapist, might be coming on. Another gentleman, I talked with you, Dr. Patino, about this, who's was a former pastor and has had some challenges in his family when it comes to mental health, transgender issues, and the like. And it really challenged his faith. He was, again, a pastor in a Christian church, and he took the road that you mentioned in our last show, which is settle for love.
Yes. And I think that we're also going to be bringing out some guests about alternative treatments like psilocybin and ketamine and different approaches to mental health treatment. Not that I'm advocating that's the only treatment, but I think that people needs to know what's in the pipeline and how we're learning more about the brain development and brain growth and brain repair from actually some drugs that have been considered illicit in the past that have become more popular, and we're working on some of those projects too.
Yeah, so please let us know which ones are interest to you and what you want to hear about. Please subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.